This podcast contains explicit language.
Bafangu!
Houston, flight is go.
Milo, let's go.
From Assignment X, thesoniashow.com, and Amalgamated Storytelling, this is the Dorking Out Show, the podcast for people who love stories from movies, TV, books, podcasts, and everywhere else.
Welcome to episode 107 of Dorking Out. This is the What Are Fans So Mad About? With Chris Taylor edition. With me today is my co-host, Emmy Award-winning filmmaker and nerd author, Christopher Allen Smith.
And with me today is my co-host, professional writer and author of The Sonia Show, Sonia Mansfield. This episode is going to be a hell of a lot of fun, so let's just get to it. Well, it used to be certain TV shows, like Star Trek or Stargate, or movies, like Star Wars or 2001, or books, like Ender's Game or The Wheel of Time, were by and large for dorks. Yes, civilians saw them, but it was the nerds and the geeks who became fanatic about them. Fandom was defined by what people loved. Now the wider world has embraced nerd culture, with Marvel and DC and the tidal waves of Star Wars movies coming onto the market, the furious success of The Walking Dead and the Game of Thrones of the world, nerd culture has gone mainstream. And along the way, it seems like something, maybe that success, has driven certain fandoms crazy. Star Trek fans seem to define themselves these days by who can hate the newest Star Trek thing first. Star Wars fans, once the lucky, handsome, talented jock of the nerd high school, has himself now fallen to the hateful scrum of social media reactions and fan theories. The Last Jedi is one of the most successful movies of the past decade, but you would think it was almost a bomb by the online reaction to it. So to pick through modern fandom, we've called in an expert, a real expert this time. Joining us today...
Not just me pretending to be
That's
one.
right. Not just me talking with a funny voice. Joining us today is Chris Taylor, veteran, top-notch journalist, currently at Mashable, but more importantly, he is the author of the fantastic and important book on a certain space opera you might be familiar with, How Star Wars Conquered the Universe. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hello, Chris, and hello, Sonia. It's a pleasure.
Hello. We are so excited to have you.
This is the Chris with my voice. You might, between the names and the erudite manner in which we talk, it might be easy to confuse us, but, no. So, Sonia, why don't you take it away with questions for our guest?
Yeah, I will let Chris talk about what he knows best, which is the fandom of Star Wars, and that kind of Star Wars and Star Trek seem to be like the prototypical fandom of our era. How do you describe the Star Wars fan then and now?
Well, that's a very broad question. So let's the Star Wars fan. I mean, in 1977, the Star Wars fan was most likely to be a Star Trek fan who had sort of graduated, they used to call it, from Star Trek to Star Wars. That was a big chunk of the fandom back then. A lot of people took what they were already doing with Star Trek, the fan fiction was a real burgeoning scene in the 70s, and just sort of ported it all over. Took down their Captain Kirk posters and put up Luke Skywalker posters. So, but as we all know, Star Wars fandom in 77 was this very broad thing, and it was the first. I would say probably the very first, if you don't count Lord of the Rings, which was sort of a slightly nerdier example of this, fandom had gone mainstream. Everyone in the summer of 77 was telling you how many times they'd seen Star Wars. Every kid was playing Star Wars in their backyards, not with actual action figures. That wouldn't happen until 78, but But, and just in terms of playing the characters, as James Arnold Taylor of Clone Wars and Rebels, Star Wars Rebels, the voice actor, told me, and there was a before and after. Before the 777, we played Cowboys and Indians, and afterwards we played Star Wars. So it was just ubiquitous. It was everywhere, and it's always retained that sense of, it being a universal language that everyone speaks. You can go to Indonesia, you can go to Botswana, you can go to Chile, and you can be reasonably assured in any sort of vaguely urban center that the person that you're talking to at least knows something about Star Wars, right? The themes are universal, the characters are known even by people who haven't seen the movie, and I tested that. That's what, big chunk of the first chapter of the book is about. It's about trying to find someone who truly didn't know anything about Star Wars. So it has this ubiquity, and since Lucasfilm was purchased by Disney, it's had this element of, this is a beloved franchise, and it's just been bought by this giant corporation, and we're a little concerned, we're afraid. What's going to happen? Is it going to treat it right? Is it going to give us too much Star Wars, which is sort of a more recent phenomenon, kind of laughable to those of us who remember the dark times.
That's right.
The dark times, yes.
The times without the Empire.
Exactly. But Disney seems to have successfully revived it, and a lot of people are pleased with the output, and a lot of people are not. But I have to say, I feel that Star Wars fandom, in my own experience, and in the experience of most of the people I talked to for the book, and most people I've talked to since, is one of the most welcoming, if not the most welcoming fandom out there. I mean, there are people who go to Star Wars Celebration who they've only seen the first movie, right? They've only seen episode 4, and that seems to be the only passport you need into this fandom, is that one time in your life you saw Star Wars, right? You saw New Hope.
Yeah.
Right.
And that thoroughly surprised me, because I have to say, going into writing the book, I'd sort of lost track of Star Wars fandom. I hadn't seen Revenge of the Sith, because I'd been so burned by the first 2 prequels that, I sort of didn't want it to end disappointingly. This thing that I loved so much from my childhood. But at the same time, I wasn't one of those nerd rage fanboys who was, moaning and rending his garments about the prequels. I was just sort of, I was disappointed. So going into it, I was like, oh no, am I going to be chopped into tiny pieces by this fandom, for coming in and trying to write about it when I haven't followed back then I thought that not reading every novel that existed in the expanded universe as it was, would be mark me out as some sort of outcast in Star Wars fandom. And of course, later I discovered that, there's only one guy who's read all the novels, and his name is Pablo Hidalgo. So it's, it was a very surprisingly forgiving and open fandom for the most part. Now, there is, and I'm sure we'll get into this, there is a tiny minority of very vocal fans, many of whom who inhabit Twitter, who can sort of give you that other impression. But I've found the opposite. I've found that my fears have been unfounded, and it is so open and so welcoming. And even in the hardest of hardcore centers of fandom, like the 501st Legion, the Stormtrooper collective, I've met folks there who say that, in their opinion, there are only 2 Star Wars movies, right? Episodes 4 and 5, and that's it. They do not see anything else. They do not think about anything else, and that's fine. They're accepted, right? As other people are mostly focused on the books are accepted, or mostly focused on Clone Wars or Rebels. It's a very, I think, ecumenical fandom, which it makes a lot of sense when you consider it's really, it's a story about a rebellion / resistance that / Jedi Order that was drawn from, many races across the galaxy, many alien beings, and many sort of social strata. It's a rebellion that included princesses and smugglers.
Right.
So it makes sense that people who have taken that on board and really listened to the lessons that the story of Star Wars is teaching you, would be very open and accepting themselves, and would never say that they don't allow droids in here.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
So-
oh, sorry, Sonia.
No, I was just going to say, so really it's maybe not that fandom has changed that much at all. It's just kind of amplified by the internet, all the vocal minority.
I think expectations have risen substantially, and that's a problem for any work of art. I think, if we had the levels of fandom around Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century, there would be a lot of people saying, I don't get his latest painting. It's a woman and she's just smiling. I don't, this is no Last Supper. He's not as...
Maybe the kids will like it. I guess that one's for the kids.
It's just he's sold out. I mean, I don't feel like in 1985 people were sort of applying this level of expectation to the Ewok movies, or
they could have withstood it. Sorry, keep going.
If you had the Ewok TV movies today, it's just the there would be 1,000 op-eds the next day about how Star Wars is dead. It's over. It's finished. Forget it. So I think that modern day Star Wars has to contend with that, that level of expectation that we expect to be transported so thoroughly. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of people expect their story expectations to be met in certain regards. And inevitably they're going to be disappointed.
Right. Well, let me jump into that a little bit, because one thing that you said about, because I've been to the Star Wars Celebration and I've been to the big Star Trek convention in Las Vegas, and that's one of the nice things about, I guess, both of those fandoms, at least at that time, is that they were very open, very friendly. Everybody was kind of positive and what they loved about their respective, shows and TV movies. But I'm wondering, in the last, I don't know, it could just be that I'm paying attention to it, but it seems like in the last 3 or 4 years, something has turned in Star Wars and Star Trek, and I'm wondering if it's just in fandom in general, that it used to be about, I love this thing, I can't wait to tell people about this thing, it's great, I'm going to try to get my friends to watch this thing because I love it and they're going to love it too. And now, it's kind of, especially the reaction to Star Trek Discovery just kind of shocked me, which is, they cast an African-American woman as the lead of the show, and you would think any fandom of any of these things, which should have been engineered to be totally open and ready and happy about that, reacted to it in this very visceral, weird way. And it seems as though between the J.J. Abrams movies, the reaction to Star Trek Discovery, and we've seen this a little bit with The Last Jedi and some other stuff, it seems like modern fandom, or maybe it's just the ones I'm paying attention to, define themselves by being kind of the first one to talk down the thing that they're ostensibly a fan of. Is that something you've noticed, or am I just cherry picking the evidence, or what do you think?
I have noticed it. I wouldn't say that I apply it to, maybe I just don't inhabit the dark corners of Twitter enough, but I hadn't seen anyone, reacting poorly to Sonequa Martin Green's casting as Michael Burnham. I thought that was, I've watched Discovery. I've written a lot about Discovery. I have some big issues with Discovery, but certainly, she's one of the bright points in it. Same goes for Anthony Rapp and, the casting of Star Trek's first ever, gay couple. I thought that was a bold move that I think, just from what I've seen was widely applauded. I think that the issue with Discovery is this question about, I think it goes very much to the soul of what is Star Trek, which is not something I can speak to with the authority of, having written about Star Wars, but, and Trek is something I'm much more of a casual fan of. But certainly I had a lot of issues with the J.J. Abrams movies. I thought that they were trying too hard to be something that Star Trek has not been.
Right.
I thought they were, J.J. Abrams clearly much more of a Star Wars fan personally than he is a Trek fan, seemed to be trying to remake Star Wars in a lot of respects. You know, and just a lot of, for me, a lot of the plot of, say, Into Darkness didn't hang together, and there was, you know,
Yes.
the rather, not to spoil the ending of it, but, you know, that rather neat thing of trying to flip the ending of Wrath of Khan.
Right.
Just, you know, and using tribbles. I mean, a lot of this, I think a lot of the issues come out of trying to do too much fan service.
Yeah.
And certainly that was my issue with Discovery. The ending particularly, you know, I'm sure that anyone who wants to see it has now seen it and knows that the Enterprise, you know, as it was 10 years before we knew the Enterprise, just shows up out of nowhere in the end of the show.
Right.
Which is sort of the, you know, for me, that was an I'm out moment. I'm not sure I can really watch the second season of that, but it was, that seemed to come of being too focused on what the fans want and too sort of desperate to service this sort of, you know, much larger swathe of fandom, some of whom are casual fans. And there seems to be, you know, sort of really calculated and false. Something, you know, about that just strikes me as kind of, you know, I see executives sitting in a boardroom saying, you know, or writers in a writer's room saying, well, what do they want? What do they want? What can we give them?
Yes.
That's the Enterprise. You know?
Right.
I feel like they're kind of damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, right? There's a certain part of the fandom that feels kind of they're owed something, that they're owed this fan service. And so you give it to them and then they say they don't want it. So you give it to them because they say they want it, but then they don't really want it. They really just want that feeling that they had the first time they watched Star Wars or Star Trek. And they're just, you're never going to get that.
I agree.
Unless you do something new, at least.
And that is, I think that way lies creative madness. If you're trying to service your fans, then you're not focusing on the story. And the story should be first, last, you know, in the middle, the only thing that you focus on.
Right.
I sort of, you know, I don't think Star Wars is immune to this. I think, you know, a lot of the criticism of The Force Awakens was valid. You know, The Force Awakens, I like to divide into two movies. I like to say that the first hour of The Force Awakens is one of the most perfect hours of Star Wars ever. And then the second hour, you know, as soon as they introduce the Death Star-like object, kind of starts to devolve into fan service. I've also had that issue with Rebels, personally, that it kind of, you know, there's a lot to love about Star Wars Rebels, but it did sort of take that path of, we're going to give you everything you want, right? You want Kanan and Hera to hook up, you know, let's actually make them space spouses like people want, you know.
Right.
You know, and you want, you've started this hashtag about hot callus, which is not going to make any sense to anyone who doesn't watch Rebel. You know, we're going to go totally overboard in fulfilling that fan need. You know?
Right.
So, yeah, I think fan service is the root of the problem. It's not the solution. I hope that more creative folks understand that. Well,
that's one thing I want to jump into, because actually a mutual friend of ours, friend of the show, huge Star Wars fan, Scott Daigle, has been on this show, online, in person, been trying to get me to watch Rebels for years. And a lot of people that I respect really say that is doing some very interesting, cool, different, you know, carrying the torch for new Star Wars. So I'm you know, interested to hear what you have to say. But
it
I'm
does.
sorry.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that it manages to. It's sort of walking this fine line between too much fan service and trying new things. And there are a couple of episodes towards the end, not the final episodes, but I think the 3 or 4 from the end, the stuff about the door. The Door to Another Realm. I don't want to give too much of it away if you haven't seen it, but it does things that Star Wars has never done before, which is always what I have my antennae up for. You know, is that sense of going somewhere new, trying something daring and different. So it does do that as well. And I feel like, Dave Filoni is a very creative fellow, the guy behind both Clone Wars and Rebels. But at the same time, he was, always trying to serve these two masters. So it's uneven is my feeling about it. And I know Scott loves it, and more power to him. He thinks it's the most creative thing in Star Wars at the moment, and I think that honor should probably go to The Last Jedi.
Well, that's great. Actually, I want to jump into The Last Jedi because for me, the reaction to The Last Jedi is just baffling, or the supposed reaction. Because I was one of those people that I really liked Force Awakens. I agreed with almost all of the critiques of it. But nevertheless, it did have that it felt like Star Wars. It was focused on delighting the audience and being fun, and then everything after that is kind of gravy for me. The Last Jedi seemed to kind of try to do the same thing while at the same time go in different directions. And using kind of the echoing motifs of previous movies to go in, it's almost as though Rian Johnson set up here are all the fan service moments, here are all the echoes of the past, and in every instance where previously we went left, we're going to go right, and we're going to see where that takes us. And I thought it was really interesting and took, kind of deconstructed you're born into this life of specialness. You're meant to, you have a special destiny, you have a this or that. You don't have a special destiny. You're here, you work, you strive, you make something of yourself. That's the way it goes. And that seemed to drive a lot of fans up the wall. It's like
I never understood what they were mad about, because in the prequels, there's all kinds of different Jedis. From everywhere. They're not all like blood relatives of the Skywalkers.
Exactly. No, exactly. And that's why Kylo's kind of speech of "you're nobody special, but you're special to me" really was an interesting way to think about it, kind of unlocking fans from the Skywalker hero worship. I agree with you 100%, but that, for me, that seems to be the thing that's driving a lot of the criticism. I don't know why. Chris, what do you think? How do you take the supposed tidal wave of criticism that The Last Jedi has endured?
I don't want to belittle it, but I think it is important to note that it is way smaller than much of the media has given it credit for. We've seen the cinema scores. We've seen we've seen the fact that the Rotten Tomatoes score was completely gamed by one guy who, sent his bot army to give it a low Rotten Tomatoes score, audience score, I should say.
Right.
But that said, let's look at what these people are saying. What is it? What is their concern? What is their issue? And I think when it comes down to it, it's mostly an emotional reaction. The guy who authored the petition that I and a lot of other people kind of mocked mercilessly on Twitter, the petition that said that Disney should strike Episode 8 from the
That's right.
He later backed down, and he said, "Look, I was in a lot of pain. I wasn't thinking straight. I don't know if he'd seen the movie again and that caused it, but he'd had second thoughts."
Right.
I think that's what I've seen a lot with The Last Jedi, that it really, the first time you see it, it punches you in the gut.
Yeah.
And some things happen that are hard to process. And that was the reaction so I was at the world premiere in LA, the first audience ever to see The Last Jedi. And, Rian Johnson was there, gripping his partner's hand, hoping there would be laughs and tears and all the rest of it. Nobody knew how the audience was going to react. And we just, I don't want to speak the entire audience, but we just came out stunned. Like, nobody talk. And the more into Star Wars you were, the more you felt like you just had a death in the family.
Right.
And it's that is, I mean, we know that grief is a very complicated set of emotions. And I think what we saw was people working out their fandom-related grief in real time on a global scale. And, I know a lot of people personally, and, anecdotally on Twitter, who didn't like it the first time, but then they watched it again. They were like, oh, okay, now it makes a lot more sense now.
Right.
I'm not just spending the entire movie with my fingernails in the armrests, just kind of hoping that everyone doesn't die in this thing.
Right.
I can actually settle down, relax, and watch it for real.
Right.
And I think when you watch it for real, you see that a lot of the story choices that it makes are inevitable. And certainly if you watch Force Awakens and Last Jedi back to back, you see that.
Right.
And there are two moments I want to discuss. Again, I don't want to spoil too much in case any of your listeners haven't seen it, but
I would assume our listeners have watched it by now.
I would assume.
We're all about dorky stuff here.
That's right.
So the moment of the start of the movie, which I think is the ultimate Last Jedi moment, where you finally get the resolution of the cliffhanger with Luke and the lightsaber.
Right.
We've been wondering for 2 years, what is he going to do with this thing? And what he does just sort of feels it. Nobody expected it to be a comedy moment.
Yeah.
This totally transgressive, I'm just going to throw the lightsaber over my shoulder. But when you think about it, what else could the story have had him do at that moment? I mean, is he going to ignite it?
Right.
Yeah, probably not. He wouldn't have run away and then suddenly decided, here's a lightsaber. I guess I'm a Jedi again.
Right.
He says it himself in the movie. Did you think I went to the most, unreachable part of the galaxy so I could just, join in the rebellion at a moment when it needed me? No, I went here to die.
Right.
And, it makes sense. A lot of people are like, well, he just sort of trashed what J.J. Abrams did. No, he followed it in the only way that made sense. You're not gonna have him ignite the lightsaber at the start of the movie. He needs to work his way back to being a hero. That's what the hero's journey is all about. You don't just get there. He's not going to say, "Oh, Rey, my daughter," even if that was the plan. He's not going to give it away in that moment. What else could you do with a cliffhanger so strong that we've been thinking about for so long, except have him just toss the lightsaber away at the ultimate comedy moment? And I think a moment, it also kind of tweaks the noses of a lot of Star Wars fans who take the franchise too seriously.
Right.
It was a golden opportunity to do that within, a part of the story in which it works for you to do that.
Right.
So it's not necessarily winking at the audience, but it is kind of, it makes me think of the Beatles. I don't know if you guys are Beatles fans, but they had this.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
They had that song on the White Album, Glass Onion, that just kind of just threw in mad random clues about what the Beatles were about, just to say, hey, you guys are all taking it too seriously. I feel like this was the equivalent of that, but also totally worked from a story perspective, totally sets up the story. So that's one instance of that. And then I just wanted to talk about another thing later in The Last Jedi. We find out Rey's parentage. We find out that her, and still you'll find people who are clinging to, some other possible explanation. But trust me, guys, this is it.
Right.
Rey's parents are no one. They were just common junk traders on Jakku. They sold her for booze money. But that is, if you go back and watch the Maz Kanata scene in The Force Awakens, Maz says to Rey, your future lies in front of you, not behind you. You're kind of hiding the truth about yourself. You're waiting for your parents, and you shouldn't wait. Right. And that glided over us at the time, but now we can see the seeds of that resolution in The Last Jedi were there all along.
Yeah.
In Force Awakens, and it's just because fans got so, I don't want to say overexcited, because that's part of what fandom is.
I want to believe that it's Ben Kenobi's daughter, or just these random I'm like, what are you talking about?
Because the galaxy only has 20 people in it.
Yes.
That's it. So,
I think that's Leia and Jabba the Hutt's daughter.
I
mean, I remember I wrote a story in 2015, right after The Force Awakens, where I laid out all the possible Rey theories. And in the one, theory number 4, she's no one.
Right.
Which turned out to be the accurate one. I quoted a female friend of mine who saw the movie and was like, her first response, I hadn't even told her what I planned to write, but her first response was, I hope she's no one. Because if she's no one, then she's me.
Right.
Yeah.
It's that sense of, The Last Jedi totally tilted us into a galaxy where anyone can have force powers. It's meritocratic. It's not, it's not an aristocracy anymore.
Exactly.
And I think, you'd be hard pressed to find people in today's society who would say that that's a bad thing. Like, no, we want to impose aristocratic values on our culture.
Yeah.
I don't think people are into that so much.
No.
Exactly. Yes. Now that I think about it, is because the reaction to The Last Jedi I found was weird because it seemed as though there are these things that we do when we watch the Star Wars movies over and over and over again, and we come up with some weird logic moments. Wait, why did they say this when earlier they said that? And there was one of these in Return of the Jedi where I think they kind of wrote themselves into a corner. You would know better than I do, which is, you told me that, Darth Vader killed my father, and Darth Vader is my father. Mm-hmm. And then Ben says, well, it's true from a certain point of view. And Luke's response, I always kind of forget it, and I think a lot of fans forget it, which is, from a certain point of view, kind of like, what the fuck are you talking about, old man? I feel really jerked around. And then you can see that Luke in this movie when he starts to lay out all the stuff that the Jedi supposedly were, the idealized version of the Jedi and then their actual track record. It's like, of course Luke is going to come to this point. His father killed kids. He almost killed a kid. And that kid turned around and killed his own father. The Jedi or the Skywalker clan, they got trouble. They are problematic, troubled people with a troubled past. But it's almost as though the Star Wars movies are told in a certain way where even diehard fans don't want to admit it, don't want to grapple with it, don't want to deal with it. And it's so when, characters in a Star Wars movie talk sensibly about their own past, it just infuriates them, which is crazy.
Yeah, they make mistakes. I mean, they are really flawed heroes. The fact that when you watch Rogue One and the original Star Wars back to back, you're like, what are you doing with those tapes? You're taking them back to the Death Star? Don't you know how many people died to get you those data tapes?
Right.
It's like, you idiots, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And again, there was a story recently in Uproxx, Mike Ryan wrote about, Luke's plan to save Han in Return of the Jedi makes no sense. When you actually get down to it, what was his plan? You can't outline it, right?
You know what? It's I gotta go. I gotta read that. I heard a lot about it. I heard a discussion of it on the Script Notes podcast, which is fantastic. I think Luke's plan actually does make sense. But it, by dribbling in his people one at a time, it's not like he can have his whole force show up and just say, all right, let's have a knockdown, drag out fight. He dribbles his people in, sets them in place, and then he springs a trap and whatever. But we don't need to.
He also gets the droids and Chewie captured. Like, that's apparently part of the plan.
I think it might be.
Jabba could have just had them instantly destroyed.
Yeah. All right, true. All right, so maybe
it's a flawed plan.
It is, and maybe my discussion of it is flawed as well. But thank God this isn't a discussion about my fan theories.
But also,
by the way, I love it when you describe all the Star Wars movies as basically the Skywalkers fighting their urges to kill children.
It is. That's the thing. I think I made that joke before the Force or before The Last Jedi came out. And what happens in the middle of The Last Jedi? Luke has a crisis of faith because he nearly murders his own nephew.
Yeah. And people are like, where did that come from? Well, maybe look at his genetics. Maybe look what his dad did.
I learned it from watching you, Dad.
The Skywalkers have flashes of anger. It's like they're Italian. I can say that as a quarter Italian myself.
Right.
You just suddenly you come to the boil and you're like, oh no, I'm not going to kill this kid with a lightsaber. It's fine.
So let me throw kind of one last question at you to kind of wrap this all up. And this is something that I think we've been circling around for a while, but I think maybe this is the crux of everything is, with the freakouts on Twitter, Facebook, comment sections on YouTube, is it just that we don't really have a fandom problem? We have an internet problem. We have a social media problem that is supposed to be, the promise of the internet and social media is it reveals the world to us in a clearer way than ever. It lets us connect more closely with people farther away more than ever. And the result, I think, we've learned in the last 2 or 3 years is it lets us express our anger and our frustration and our meaner instincts better. But it's not really helping us out a lot when it comes to clarity and vision.
I think eventually you get to clarity. You sort of have to go through the argument stage. I feel like Twitter is a toddler at the moment. We're just sort of learning how to talk to each other. And I think you can look at any point in history, when traders suddenly start to come together in cities like Venice and other, hot points of trade, and the London coffee houses of the 18th century. These were sort of pretty rambunctious places. People wanted coffee houses shut down because they thought, oh God, these people are drinking caffeine and they're having arguments with each other.
Right.
It gets nasty in there. And Twitter has a problem. I think more so than Facebook has its own issues. Twitter is where I spend most of my time, so I'll talk to that. It has a problem in policing its community, and it's allowed a certain kind of certain things flourish there, racism, misogyny that really shouldn't be allowed to flourish. But I feel like the company is learning slowly to start policing that better, and I feel like people are learning how to argue on Twitter better. I feel like I see that a little bit every day. It sort of ratchets a little bit closer to, civil discourse. But I don't think we should expect if you build a Tower of Babel and you have, all the world's languages babbling together in there, you're not going to get peace, love, and harmony immediately, if ever. Right? It's going to be very contentious. And that's maybe what we want. That's democracy. That's the marketplace of ideas. And we want to police it and make sure that no one is being, insulted in a way that approaches hate crime. But at the same time, it's going to get a bit messy in there. And I think that's what's happened to fandom is, again, imagine Twitter after the Ewoks movies. Imagine Twitter if we'd had Twitter during the prequels.
Right.
George Lucas stopped looking at the internet in about 2002 because it got so personal. He said so mean. He was reading these comments about himself and what he'd done with the prequels.
Right.
And that was before. My God, today you can't even imagine the vitriol.
It's so easy for like-minded people to find each other on the internet, and they just kind of feed off each other's hate.
Yes.
And then hate leads to the dark side.
Exactly. I think that's, and I think I see lots of positive signs in Star Wars Twitter. I think Star Wars Twitter is like 99% a very fun, friendly, positive place. If you follow the people who are most active in it, you're going to pull some great conversations, and maybe they'll sort of fall out occasionally over the latest Rebels episode, or there'll be some contentious issue, but they'll be basically civil and benign to each other. And there's a new account which I have to say personally, I've taken a Twitter break for the last week, so I haven't seen if this has progressed. But when last we left Twitter, there was an account called, I think, Toxic Star Wars Fandom that was set up specifically to try and showcase and shame the worst instances of, where the fringes of fandom were getting more toxic. But I think that so I feel like that's a self-policing mechanism that has kicked in. And I feel like we're going to get more of that as the discourse continues and people learn how to talk to each other again. And maybe one day Twitter won't exactly be a nice place, but it'll be a nicer place.
That would be great.
I think that the people who say the meanest things, certainly in Star Wars Twitter, are the people on the fringes, and the people who, when you investigate it further, their arguments fall apart. I mean, I recently had a knockdown Twitter fight with a guy who said that, you can't just introduce, force projection like The Last Jedi. You can't just introduce a new Jedi power. And I sort of argued him down to, well, they were introducing new Jedi powers all the time in the original trilogy. And he's like, yeah, but that's the original trilogy.
Oh, wow.
Sense, there has to be a first
They
time.
can't introduce anything new. The movies have to be exactly the same all the time.
That's
and
right.
That's what his argument came down to, and that just sort of became apparently obvious. And I was like, okay, great, peace out. I'm done with this. This isn't an interesting argument anymore. So I feel like, that kind of dialectic is going on all the time, and we eventually get to a point where the bad arguments lose.
Good.
I know that Smith said that his question was the last question, but I actually have one more question.
Please.
What do you think are some of the more healthy fandoms out there? Because I feel like Star Wars and Star Trek, they fight a lot of infighting. As Smith mentioned, the Rick and Morty fans. Do you think there's any out there that are maybe a little bit more well balanced?
I think
maybe Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or.
Yeah, maybe Harry Potter. I was going to say, the Agatha Christie fandom is sort of really, really civil.
My husband would say the Sherlock Holmes fandom is
the Murder, She Wrote fandom. They're just nicest people you could ever meet.
That's true. Unfortunately, they're dying off 100 a day. And with your contributions, we can make the Angela Lansbury National Memorial Statue sorry, no. Keep going.
It's kind of odd, given that, these would be, if they existed, fandoms all about murder. But
which brings us back to the Skywalkers. No,
exactly.
Okay, continue.
No, I think it's just, the level of toxicity around the edges is just a sign that people are really into this thing and they're really passionate about it. And I think it was Pablo Hidalgo who said this once. We were talking about, I believe it was before The Force Awakens. They were talking about fears that The Force Awakens script might leak. And he pointed out that I think it was the Trek Into Darkness script that had leaked early online. And it was just like nobody, it didn't become a thing because people just didn't care that much. It was kind of a zinger at Star Trek fandom. But you could say the same, what if the leak for the next Transformers movie, the script for the Transformers movie leaked online tomorrow? Would people really care that much? Or would they look at it and just be like, yep, figures?
Would they look at it and say, I don't have time to read these 3 pages? Sorry. It's a very obvious joke, but I just could not restrain myself.
It's true. No, I think Harry Potter fandom, from what I can tell, seems to be a lot less contentious. I sort of, I'm not in that. I see around the edges of it. There are a lot of folks at Mashable who set up and help operate Harry Potter conventions. And that seems to be extremely positive, which would make sense. It's much more of a story of, not just that you experience in childhood, but about children. So it's a little harder to gainsay that. Having said that, you look at the Cursed Child play, kind of divided Harry Potter fandom down the middle. That's true. Its equivalent of the prequels.
Actually, that's right. Yeah.
We'll see how the fandom holds up when the next Fantastic Beasts movie comes out.
God, yeah, I mean, it's already kind of tearing itself apart about, Johnny Depp and J.K. Rowling's support of him. And, should that be an issue? People don't really know. I feel like they're about to experience kind of what Star Wars fandom went through in 99. Maybe it comes to all fandoms. Maybe it's a stage that everyone has to go through.
Makes sense.
All right. Well, Chris Taylor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for lending us your expertise. Usually we are not this quiet, but listening to you talk about all this was a lot of fun and very informative. Is there anything else that you would like to say? Any place you'd like to direct people to pay attention to you?
Yes,
online,
where can people find you?
Well, I've ended my Twitter vacation, so I'm finally back on Twitter at FutureBoy.
Cool. And are you working on any other books? I should probably ask.
Yes, sort of. There are a lot of projects in the early stages I'm not quite ready to talk about, but yeah, there will be more books eventually. I've not yet, to the disappointment of a lot of people who messaged me on Twitter, I've not yet written anything further on, I'm not planning to write another book on the history of Star Wars. Maybe after episode 9 we can revisit that, but my intention with How Star Wars Conquered the Universe was always that it was going to be a one-volume history, and that's held true so far, and we'll see how that goes.
All right.
Now, I want you to rewrite your book exactly the way you wrote it the first time, but tweak it just a little bit so it feels different.
I actually wanted to do with that. My publishers turned this down, but I wanted to do that with the paperback. I wanted to call it the special edition.
Oh! That's obvious. It's sitting right there.
Just change enough things that you felt like you had to buy it again.
You should have done it. That would have been great. Well, you know what? Awesome. You could still do it. You can still do it. But all right, Chris Taylor, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Sonia, is there anything else that you would like to say before we get out of here?
I will just say thank you to Chris and goodbye.
Bye.